Many thanks to David and Beth and Ian for inviting me over to talk a little about the some of the pollen results that we got from some preliminary coring we did in this area about 3 years ago. And of course, we all know that COVID has got in the way since then. And the brief is to actually explain some of the vegetation results, but also to give you a crash course on the science behind pollen analysis. And it is going to be a really crash course. Undergraduates are going to get about 20 hours of this across years 1 and 2. You're getting about 20 minutes. So I hope it's lucid. Some of it's going to go, you'll know about it. Some of it might be a little tricky. So we'll carry on, please, David. So yeah, bit of context, a brief introduction to the science of pollen analysis, coring it to Bedlin's Pond, Herefordshire, and then some of the pollen evidence, Bedlin's Pond, and the environment, and then hopefully some conclusions. So, again, please. Yeah, so we'll talk about what is pollen, where is it produced, pollination, how it can be used to reconstruct paleo environments, past environments, and then the scientific basis, the basis being that these pollen grains and plants produce different pollen grains. We identify the pollen grains and we can link it to the vegetation that produced that those pollen grains through time. Okay, so we'll talk about building a pollen diagram and then taking it apart or interpreting it. All right, thank you very much. Okay, so pollen. I would say, hand on heart, that everyone in this room knows what pollen is. But when I speak to undergraduates, 17, 18-year-olds, a lot of them do not know what pollen is. So it's the male gamete, it's the male sex cell, and it's produced in the anther of a flower. And the anther is the stamen. Yeah. And next slide, please. Yeah, so the pollen grains transport the male DNA to the stigma, which is the female part of the flower, and comprise the stigma, the style, and the ovary. That's basic biology, of course. And it's the ovary, yeah, ultimately where the seed is produced. This is where undergraduates really get confused because they equate pollen grains with seeds. And a year 3 essay, I kid you not, said pollen grains land on the ground and take root. No, not all like that. Next slide. Okay, so we need to differentiate between pollen grains and the seeds which come from pollen grains when pollinations occur. And we know that the seed, the dandelions, the winged nuts of the maple and the sycamores, the berries of the hollies, yeah, the water plants, and of course the hazelnuts and oak acorns. Okay, so and they have different mechanisms. So let's differentiate between the seeds, which are important, but also the pollen grains. So pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of a flower of the same species. And there are two essentially types of pollination. One is self-pollination, where a flower allows pollen to fertilize the egg cell within the ovary of the same plant. It's disadvantageous ecologically to species as resultant seeds less likely to form a healthy plant. Most plants cross-pollinate. And this is where a flower transfers pollen from anther to stigma of different plants of the same species, and that's more advantageous ecologically speaking. Most plants in the world cross-pollinate. There are a few that self-pollinate, and one of the plants which forms the basis of human survival are the cereals. Some of the cereals, like wheats, self-pollinate. They produce very little pollen grains, and that feeds into our interpretation later on when we identify fossil pollen grains of the cereal. Okay, so cross-pollinating plants need to get their pollen grains from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower. That means they're produced in huge quantities. Anyone with hay fever readily knows that that can be a pain from this time of year onwards, from around about March onwards to late summer. So pollen generally produces huge quantities. The exceptions are the self-pollinating plants that tend to produce relatively fewer pollen grains, and of course they are some of the cereals that are important to identify human economy and agricultural activity in the past. So pollen is produced mainly from the spring to mid-late summer, and pollen production varies hugely. For example, pine produces 10 times more pollen than a beech tree. So already starting to get biases being introduced into any resultant data we get from a sediment core when we analyze the pollen. And how pollen grains are dispersed is also important. Okay, so two main ways. We all know about the wind-pollinated plants. Yeah, they produce huge quantities by the flower. The pollen is usually small, light, and smooth. And, for example, the grasses, which is one of the biggest causes of hay fever in the summer. Some plants have actually developed a symbiotic relationship with an animal vector. Think of bees, for example. So some pollen is produced in relatively small amounts, and the grains tend to be larger and stickier because they need to adhere to that animal vector to take the pollen grain from the male plant to the female plant. And these are transferred by insects, for example, dandelions, daisies, tulips, roses, for example, are all animal pollinated. About 75% of the plants on Earth are pollinated by animals. That's about 25% are wind pollinated, which has important implications for keeping and maintaining our insect population. So billions of pollen grains being produced each year, and a lot of that is not used for reproduction. So a lot of it is just wasted. Pollen grains that land in the soil are readily eaten by earthworms and other soil microfauna, or just oxidized and rot away. But some pollen grains will be deposited on wet peat bogs or lake surfaces, and because of those waterlogged conditions, they are preserved. Yeah, they do not rot. The waterlogged environment preserves them intact. And there are several route ways that pollen can take to land in those waterlogged conditions. So there is pine. Come May, pine trees usually flower around about May. So you've got one in your garden, go down and shake it, no doubt you'll be seen in spring, your car's coated with all this yellow dust. Yeah, that's the pollen grain. So just go to your pine tree, shake it, and you will see millions of pollen grains getting into the wind, because it's wind pollinated. So it's producing a lot. So deposition on a surface of a bog, we don't need to take this diagram to extreme, but there's lots of pathways that pollen can take in the atmosphere. It can rain out of the atmosphere. The canopy of the trees surrounding the site produces pollen, then which falls and rests on this bog. Rivers or watercourses can bring pollen grains in, and the pollen can flow down the trunks of the trees onto the site. And then there's a local component as well. For example, it's a marsh, and those marsh plants also produce pollen that gets deposited locally. And of course, we can actually think of a fen or a valley bog, or a raised bog, indeed, in this part of the world as well, Wales. To the west, we've got sort of lots of blanket peat deposits. So fossil pollen is a proxy vegetation change. Yeah. It's this guy who invented it. Science about over 100 years old now. It had its centenary in 2016. And it's Leonard von Post who hit upon the notion that if he went to somewhere waterlogged, he was from Stockholm University, lots of waterlogged deposits in Scandinavia, and he took a core, and this is the very first pollen diagram, and I think you'll agree with me, it's an instrument of torture. Essentially, what it's doing is showing depth, yeah, from the surface, and then each of those lines is the abundance of a particular pollen type that it's plant through time. Okay, and it's these pollen grains he's looking at from his samples of sediment. Okay. So that's what, again, so that's what Leonard von Post did. He took a core of sediment from his peat bog. And there's several ways we can actually do that. Do it again. One of the ones we used in Herefordshire, I think Beth used an open gouge corer. There's one called a Russian corer. And it's a very invasive type of coring device. And this one's a 50 centimetre long one. You can get them about a metre. So I think we used a metre. And it's a side sampling device. And you'll see it in operation if the technology works, and the little movie clip I've got is going to play. So it's got a fin or an anchor plate or blade. And when you put it in the surface of the peat bog, that blade keeps it still. And then we turn the corer and slice it around the blade. Pictures worth 1,000 words. So let's put the next one. Okay, so it's already in the ground. It's been put in there. There's the anchor plate. That will anchor the corer in the peat bog, and then you'll see the body of the corer will turn round and slice the peat. Do you want to try it? It didn't work. You want to go back? Just go back a bit. Go back one, and can you click on the? Aha!
There we go.
Warren, Night Pod, 26th of September 2013. Russian coring anchored. Russian corer going into the sediments. The blade there is anchored in the feet. Now we'll turn it clockwise, half turn.
Okay, so you see the corer turning round.
It's stationary.
The anchor plate.
The Russian corer actually, hang on a minute. Russian corer actually is now turned and cut 50 centimetres per 1 metre.
Very keen. Technician and undergraduate wants to get out the ground.
Okay.
This is in North
There's the fin of the Russian corer. That's what anchors the corer into the peaty sediments. There's that lovely grey clay there again. So
you open the side, open the chamber,
which is just
sample those peats. We can take that
corer. Exposed sediments.
You see the change in sediments as well. Nice peat deposit. There's a band of grey clay there. That represents a different deep fishing environment. So something's happened in that small catchment
Really?
to change the segmentation.
Towards the.
So that's the top.
Down for.
Down to the bottom.
Okay.
Down face. So the deeper you go, the older it gets. Thank you. What we did at Snipe Bog here in Herefordshire is you do different drives. So drive A, take the segment, then you use a parallel core to go down again, and you keep on swapping, going down 50 or 100 centimeters down to the bottom as far as you can go. So this is what we did at Netherlands. Again, please. And here we use the 1 metre Russian. Okay. And courtesy of Ian, he's collated the sediment core. So there's the top, going all the way down. You can actually see the changes in the deep fishing environment and the nature of the sediments that are deposited back through time. And you can see these different changes here and here. Okay. And again. So that's our core, yeah? We parcel that up into guttering, wrap it in cling film, get it back to the lab. Again, please. And again. So there's our core. It's top and bottom. Again, the undergraduates, you don't label top and bottom. They swap it around. You can actually anticipate the consequences of that. And we take subsamples. You can't sample and study the core in its entirety. You'd be here until eternity, sampling every centimetre of sediment. So you have to adopt a sampling strategy. And every so often you take pollen samples again, please. And those samples are relatively about 1 cubic centimeter, about the size of your little finger around the nail. And they're put into the lab. All the non-pollen is removed from the lab. You left the pollen grains. You count those pollen grains under a microscope, and you just essentially count all the different pollen grains that you see. And that is your reconstruction of vegetation environmental change through time. And again, you've got a nice organic layer. You take a slug of that sediment, a bit of that sediment, and send, pay your £500, I think it is, and you get your nice radiocarbon date from East Kilbride in Scotland, and that gives you a date for that particular piece of sediment. Okay, so you've got your change through time and your date and your sediment. So building your pollen diagram, there's that. There's that sediment core, and again, let's keep on pressing. There's the subsamples. There's the y-axis, and then you can build your pollen diagrams. So the software you use counts all your birch pollen and shows the changing abundance through time. So the top is up here, that's more modern day. Going deeper down is further back into the past. Again, please. Again, the animation's a bit wonky here. Again, again, again. Pine then comes on. Again, 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 and etc. Then pine, oak, lime or linden, and then other tree species such as alder and ash. Each one is as a series of histograms across your pollen diagram. Again, yeah, again, again. And then you get what's called a pollen diagram. You've got an example of one in your conference pack. All right, so this is from King's Pool in Shropshire. So it's a percentage pollen diagram. All the data are expressed as percentages of each other. And a summary diagram only shows main taxa. So there's 50, 60, 100 other pollen types that are deemed as being minor and are not shown because it complicates all the complications. Now again, an instrument of torture, but not as bad as the one that Lennart posted 116 years ago. All right, so and you get this summary plot. So everything to the left here is trees and shrubs. You have a summary plot, so the dark grey is all the trees. Everything to the right up here are the herbs, the low story, and the tilted herbs is the stippled area. So that summary plot tells you a little bit about how open the environment is. Okay, so there's a technique of interpreting some of this diagram. Yeah, so we'll have an exam later. There's two main pieces of evidence. One is looking at that summary curve, yeah, and that tells you how open the landscape is. So you can just look at the diagram and say, ah, it's devoid of trees down here, it must be open, it's grassland. Or further up, lots of tree pollen, therefore it's a well-wooded environment. All right, so landscape might be open due to climate change, especially for earlier periods, following the last ice age, for example. Or it might be open due to activities of humans on the landscape, something I'm particularly interested in a research area. For example, tracking the instance of farming and animal grazing. So that's that summary plot. That's when you're looking at pollen diagram. That's the first protocol. The indicator approach is looking at the actual pollen grains themselves. So some of them are really valuable to us. So these are the crop plants that we actually grow that form our economy. So think of the cereals, yeah, the wheats, the oats, the barley, the rye. Where I work in the Eastern Mediterranean, olive is important, as well as grapevine, nuts, and these pollen, can you do it again, please? These are the pollen grains that you see. There's wheat, there's olive, there's vitis or grape, there's juglans or walnut, and believe it or not, during the medieval period, lots of cannabis was grown. and that's kind of a spot. Yeah, so we can actually track where the medieval period in multi-pollen diagrams was a huge spike, an increase in grains of cannabis. I don't think it was done. It's more to do with retting and hemp and rope. So it's rope, not dope. One wonders what it'd be like if it was dope. Okay, please. And then the other range of pollen grains that tell us about what's happening on the landscape are the weeds that invade our agricultural lands, our fields. So these are the weeds that benefit from our agro-pastoral activities, including cropping and grazing. And if you just click through now, I think some of the weeds come up. And they're all very distinctive. That's probably my favourite pollen. It's goosefoot. It's Chenopodius. And it looks a bit like golf ball. Okay, so you can actually then start to get a handle on how a pollen diagram works. You've got these important weeds up here. When they increase, that means some activity is happening on the landscape, which is probably human use. Thank you. And this is the pollen diagram from Netherlands. So it's in your handout, because sometimes it's easier to read when it's in front of you, as opposed to being on the screen. So Ian was very fortuitously getting some cash to buy 3 radiocarbon ages. It probably cost a small fortune, and these were returned. Prior to that, we did not know what the age of this sequence was. We can guess that the occurrence of these trees here puts it somewhere just after the last ice age. But the radiocarbon ages, there's a dot there, a dot there, a dot there, representing where those radiocarbon ages came from in the 7th sequence. So the pollen diagram begins somewhere around about 10,200 calibrated years BP. That's about 1,000 years after the last ice age. And then another radiocarbon age is produced here, about 9,000 calibrated BP. So we're well into the sort of the early Holocene on this diagram. Now, the undergraduate Jack Bowen, this is part of his undergraduate dissertation at Birmingham. He did a good job, despite limitations of the coring. And if you look at the total land pollen, it's around about 100. So you get to here, and it's 1 or 2 or 3 pollen grains. Now, this was professionally counted. We'd be counting at least 350 to 500 pollen grains per level. But we can't ask an undergraduate to do that because he'd still be there doing it rather than having graduated and got a job. So everything from around up here is highly tentative. It's just not representative. We're not seeing enough pollen grains or counting enough pollen grains to give it a scientific basis. So we can actually use statistics as well to get all the pollen grains divided into zones. Yeah, again. Yeah, so we can actually divide the data into sort of 4 major pollen zones. And so nothing's happening down here. I always find this very suspicious when suddenly all the pollen starts to increase suddenly. That tells me there's a hiatus or a gap. But it does show the development of woodland in the region around about 9,000 years ago. We've got increases in birch. I think that is alder, yeah, and elm, and oak, and pine, increasing coming into the region around about 9,000. So that's the total trees. They're the shrubs, hazel, and they are the herbs. Okay. Now you'll note that the diagram up here, the top of the diagram, is a radiocarbon age of 6,400 cal BP, and that's when there's no more sediments above that. That's dated. All right, so they've gone. And that's a problem we find in some of these shallow ice age ponds in Hertfordshire. The sediments are just not there. They've been eroded. And for me, that's a shame because that's when the fun starts. So everything on this diagram is natural environmental change. It's Earth systems responding to the climate changes after the last ice age. I'm very much interested in how humans are messing with the planet, and that's when their footprint starts to appear after that age. Yeah, so one wonders if their activities are responsible for all the missing sediments. Yeah, but that's the most interesting part I have in my research. I try and track how humans are impacting these environments. Okay, next one, please. So we've got to go to other codes. Have I got right time? Okay, so I'll try and run through this. Okay, so to look at what's happening before Netherlands deposition sediments, we can go to another site called Brunelid. It's in South Wales. That's the limit of the last ice advance. It's fairly old now. There's probably new data on that. But Brunelid was just inside the limit of glacial ice, the last ice age. Again, please. Can you keep on pressing it? Okay, at the very bottom, glacial till down here. So that's ice age sediment. And there's also ice age sediment here. And you can actually see there's loads of radiocarbon ages. They spent a small fortune on radiocarbon dating this site. And it shows how there's a decrease in grass, yeah, and an increase in birch. So that's an open environment down here, the basal sections. An increase in birch. There's also an increase in juniper, which then decreases as the main expansion of birch takes over. And juniper cannot compete with birch. It just gets outcompeted and decreases. And then birch increases a few dips, and then it decreases down to this cold period known as the Younger Dryas cold period. So technically, officially, that was the end of the last ice age, around about 14,500 years ago. It got warmer, but then there's an interruption back to colder conditions known as the Younger Dryas, which then sent birch levels plummeting, and then the ice age finished for good around 11,500 years ago, and then we see this massive increase in birch pollen again. Another increase in juniper, which then decreases as birch increases, and the whole story is repeated. This diagram details around about 9,000 years ago, so we have to go on to another diagram to sort of reconstruct vegetation changes around the same. Can you just rack it through? Normally this would animate itself. Okay, so we can go back to that diagram again, King's Pool. In Shropshire, the information on vegetation history at the last ice age, about 10,000 years, is missing from Netherlands Pool, that earlier period, but we've caught it at King's Pool, Shropshire. So you can see that increase in birch down here in the basal layers. There's an increase in pine, and then elm, and oak, lime or linden comes in, and again alder and ash. Not well represented, but there's that big increase in hazel. So there's that summary diagram that shows an open environment towards the last ice age, and massive increase in woodland indicators, woodland pollen, more or less to 99% woodland pollen, yeah, and this decrease in the open habitat herbs such as sedge and grass. So, you know, it's often been likened to a wall-to-wall environment of trees. A squirrel could go from Land's End to John O'Groats without touching the ground. That's the often quoted analogy. And then we start seeing some dips in the pollen further on. I'm going to try again. Can you just go back? Okay, so that bit down there, that's around 5,000 years ago. So that's the first indication of Neolithic peoples on the landscape. Bit of an impact, not much. That's the Bronze Age. Bit of an impact. Bigger than that on the woodland. But this is the Iron Age. Massive woodland clearance. And then that's going to be here. Look, we've got cannabis appearing. Cereals and cannabis appearing. Yeah, so it's reckoned that the British Isles lost half its woodland here at the Iron Age. And it lost the other half in the creating that open habitat. Okay, so am I all right? Just to move to this conclusion. So carbon-14 age date from Netherlands ponds, sediment course sedimentation began around 9,000 years ago. It's largely ice-free from this about 10,500 years ago. Rich solars and standspatch largely ice-free from 14,000 years ago. So these are bigger sediment depositional basins. They've got a longer suite of sediments than Netherlands. So Netherlands pond is somewhat later. Earlier sediment may be missing because of this hiatus. Sediment and pollen data suggests grasslands and disturbed ground at British scholars and standspatch. And low pollen counts at Netherlands pond means that pollen interpretations are only tentative for that period just after the last ice age, due to those low pollen counts. However, the low pollen counts can indeed be interpreted due to low pollen production and therefore an open environment. Pollen data from British scholars and standspatch suggests grassland with some dwarf juniper, willow and birch at this time, but it's probably dwarf, so they're the dwarf kinds of the trees, dwarf birch, dwarf juniper. And unfortunately, the pollen grains are identical than true tree types. Implies birch was locally represented. It increases quite markedly at the beginning of the Holocene, which implies that there was a local refugium, there's a local concentration of birch. And again, in these studies, we try and highlight these sort of local refugia. It's where the trees were hanging out during these cold periods. Following birch, all sites, Netherlands Pond, British scholars and standspatch follow the traditional post-glacial pattern of forest advance that we see in the British Isles. That initial increase in birch, hazel, elm, oak, pine, and alder that I showed you for the King's Pool strategy diagram. Although that's at different timings. Yeah, and then subsequent changes, those human-induced, those human-driven changes, we can chart the Neolithic elm decline and the Tilia decline during the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods. So prior to about 5000 BP, these changes are driven largely by natural causes, such as climate change and increased moisture and temperature, but also after about 5000 BP, humans are having more impact on the environment of British Isles. And I think I'll finish there at the end. Okay.
Brilliant.
I think it might be the end.
Yeah.
So thank you.
I'm going to stand here too. We're running a little bit behind. Not sure this is helping. But we've got questions for Ian, very briefly, that we've had online. One person wanted to know, have we done a comparison between our ponds, which, as Ian said, the closed depression, so they've not got an inlet or an outlet, and dew ponds, which are in a similar situation? And Ian's shaking his head. I could answer this. I'm afraid we haven't got that data. Our project just focused on this, but you never know. Once you start shouting about these things, maybe it'll lead to some more research. I suspect the findings would be similar. Do we have any questions for Warren about, oh, that might be the case, about the peat pores?
Questions are always.
Sorry, yes. I was always told that oak was the dominant species in this country, yet it doesn't seem to appear on your charts.
Right, yeah. when you say country? Right, okay. So I could show you a nice map. State of the nation would be at 5,000 BP. That cuts off between when the vegetation of the British Isles was impacted by humans. It's a nice map. I can provide it in the pack if you wish. And it does show that most of Wales and the western parts of the marches is oak dominated. But England, what's the quintessential tree of England? I always get people say, oh, but it's not. It's lime. It's lime. And the reason people say oak is because oak pollen. You look in the pollen diagram. There's tons of oak. Oak is a bit like pine. It produces this huge quantities of pollen, and it floods. It floods the sample, so it's overrepresented. But lime isn't. It's insect pollinated. It's one of the few trees that are insect pollinated, so therefore it produces very little pollen. So when this map was drawn up, it shows most of England, central England, as lime, the lime tree, because they've been using other lines of evidence, such as macrofossils from archaeological sites, and the twigs and seeds the Neolithic people and the Bronze Age people fed to their stalled animals. Take the lime weeds and feed them. So it's one of these questions that trips people up, but it's essentially, I think we're on the cusp here, on the traditional zone between lime and oak further west.